All right, we're recording. This is office hours for service APIs on July 29. Obviously, we're, well, at least hopefully still trying to hit an August sometime V1 Alpha 1 release, so we're getting awfully close to that. Looks like we've got plenty on the agenda today. As always, anyone is always welcome to add things to any agenda at any point. I just filled this out with things that I thought would be worth talking about, and Damien added something as well, it looks like. My first question for today was if it would make sense to try to merge some of our docs and final proposals into a single doc. And this sounds kind of strange, I admit, but basically, right now, it seems like it'd be, as we're looking towards V1 Alpha 1, it seems like it'd be very helpful to provide a straightforward way to review the entire API and comment on different portions. I know James has kind of alluded to this before. It'd be helpful if we had groups or people just looking through the API top to bottom, not just little bits here and there. And an idea was, well, if we could throw this all, in a way, it sounds like we're going backwards again. But we have a few docs that are kind of dispersed, and then we have what's already in code and what we expect is going to make it there. And if we could combine all that into a doc, I'm thinking it might make it easier to get feedback among ourselves, and even maybe from some others that haven't looked at the API yet with the same detail we have, but it might be one consistent place to get some pre-alpha review. But I know that just means one additional thing to maintain. So I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Does that make sense? Sound annoying? Cool. Well, I'll take no pushback as no pushback, and I'll work towards that. I'm hoping to get some more feedback, and also I'm hoping that having it all in one place will make it easier to see things that may or may not make sense. All right. Well, the next thing I had on the agenda was, or Damien added, was traffic splitting. And I think the news now is just that it's merged. Yeah, it looks like Bowie has approved that. So congrats. Thank you for all your work on that, Damien. I don't know, is there anything else we should talk about here?
No, I don't think so. Just wanted to make sure it was on the agenda because I thought the PR was ready to review and potentially merge. So thanks everyone who reviewed and provided feedback, especially Harry, you, Rob, Bowie, and Jeremy, and others. So thank you.
Great. Great. Excited to get that in. Thanks for the persistence on that one. All right. I just wanted to go through, we've had a few PRs come up, which is awesome. I just want to make sure that they got appropriate attention here. Harry opened a PR to correct conformance for regex support. I think this is fine. Harry, it looks like you're on the call. Were you able to test this and verify that this works? That was my only comment on this one.
I copy pasted that from another area where it was mentioned, and the CRD was, I think the CRD generated is correct. So if you scroll down.
Right, yeah, no, the CRD generation looks fine. I ran into some strange issues before with the combination of defaulting and required values, where if a value was required and the default would not happen before the required check. I guess validation must happen after defaulting, which would be nice. I hope. That was the last bit I was trying to confirm.
I do not know that. Yeah, I probably need to check that.
Because what I would hate here is for this to effectively become a required field, which is not. And maybe there's just no way around it. I don't know. But it would be really nice if that default could actually apply before we got to this validation.
Wait, so
But
is this a required field right now? It's not.
it is not. No, it is not. I don't believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So hopefully it's a non-issue, and even if it is, it's not actually an issue with your implementation. It would be an issue with CRD implementation. So yeah.
I don't think
But
CRD
for
supported defaulting.
yeah, it does. It does. No, the only thing I was concerned about was, and it's probably a non-issue, was the order of operations, ensuring that defaulting happened before validation, because I know that defaulting does not happen before a required check. But yeah, I think it's hopefully a non-issue. The actual diff here all looks fine to me though. So
Okay. Let me check that and then.
okay.
On back. Yeah. Thanks for the review.
Then you have another PR that pluralizes matches. And I think this one may require a bit more discussion. I can't remember exactly where we left off in the last meeting, but I know there was a lot of discussion around the idea of anding versus oring these rules together.
So this was last time I brought it up. It was controversial. I still expect some discussion on this one here as well. So I've tried, like last time, I think it was not clear as to how things would be used because of lack of documentation in that Google Doc. This is from the actions proposal. So what I did was I actually figured out, like, just let me write down the Google Doc so that we can have a discussion, right? And if this is still confusing, we should definitely avoid it. But this is to start a conversation. I've yet to see your comment on this one though.
Yeah, my comment here is just I think I was in the minority, but I actually agree with this approach. Though I also don't understand the full consequences of it. My understanding is this would make it straightforward to match multiple paths and assign them the same forward to, essentially. Whereas if you made this an anding match, that obviously would not, an and for this kind of match would be very confusing. If you had two different path values, it would never be true. I think some of the concern here may have been that this would be difficult to implement. And I can't remember exactly who had raised those concerns, but I'm interested in learning more about that.
Implementation is a concern here, then I'm also interested. Last I remembered it was more about readability of the API. So.
Okay.
Bo is a robot, I think.
Yeah, mostly a robot. I can kind of hear you.
Reload and see.
Okay.
Okay. Is it better now?
Much better. Yes.
Okay. I think, is there an example where it's not this? Because this example can be very easily accomplished without too much effort by just duplicating the block above it, I guess, like having another rule. But the motivation for having multiple matches via a list, it must be different than this use case, or is it this use case?
So, you're breaking out. So I'll try to. I think what I got from it was, what is the motivation? Is this the current example, the use case, or something else here? So yes. So I think you can duplicate the entire rule, right? The HTTP route rule is an array inside HTTP route resource and under the spec. You can duplicate it, but imagine a situation where you have set up a forward to, and you also are using, extension points to define, further, something like actions, which is not part of the API yet, but I'm working on that. So if you have that, that leads to a lot of duplication, and it leaves room for errors, because that will be manual, right? You could template it out, that, but it still leaves room for error. So that's why uh, I added this one, and this is something done in some proxies. I've seen that.
Oh, I see. So you basically have the same service. The same. Sorry, the audio is just really bad. I don't know why.
Correct. So it's the same. So you're whatever you're matching, you are taking the same set of actions, filters, whatever you call, right? But in the basic sense, you're forwarding it to the same service. Yes.
Yeah, I like this because it feels like it's really just a shortcut that it's not fundamentally changing. As far as I understand this, this isn't fundamentally adding new new behavior per se, like anything new that an implementation needs to support. The very naive way of implementing this, I think, would just be to split each of these matches out into their own rule. This is just a shortcut to that kind of approach. But the same thing could be communicated right now in the current API. It would just be more verbose because you need a separate rule for every match.
Yeah, this doesn't seem too bad. So the things I get scared of is if it results in a multiplication. But this one is like having n of these things under matches is only times one forward to. The one I get kind of concerned is if it's like n times m, and then in the underlying thing you have to kind of do like n times m thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did anyone else have any thoughts or concerns about this? I remember it being more controversial when we initially discussed this, but I can't completely remember why.
I think James has something to say.
I had a question. So this implies ordering correct. So the global order for matches would be all the matches in the first rule followed by all the matches in the second rule and so forth. Is that correct?
No, this one does not employ any sort of ordering at all. We don't have ordering and precedence defined in the API yet at all.
That is a great question, though. I imagine that the idea of rule itself is going to, ordering is potentially going to matter in the order of a route rule. And so you can imagine that the easiest interpretation of this would be each additional match just translates into an additional route rule, effectively, like further down the, so the first match is the equivalent of a route rule at that index, and the next match is the equivalent of a subsequent route rule at that index. But if ordering was meaningful at the route rule level, it seems like it would be equally meaningful here, though I guess we have not defined what that meaning is yet.
I think that it's kind of implicit, right? Because the slice of matches in the rule are OR conditions. So you have to go through. So you're going to have to process all of those OR conditions, and then and then if it falls through to the next, if there's no match, it would fall through to the next rule, and then process all those OR conditions. Is that how you were thinking about it, Harry?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So essentially, I mean, the way you would match in case if this feature was not present. And the way you would implement this feature is essentially duplicate each match into its own rule, right? The semantics with that way of implementing multiple matches and the semantics in this PR, they're exactly the same.
That is a really good point, though. This does potentially complicate conflict resolution here if the interpretation of this is not identical to the interpretation of multiple route rules.
It is identical, I meant.
Okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is.
Okay.
So I guess the
Okay.
other thing that the other issue that the other thing maybe to discuss is whether we should do these sorts of YAML minimization changes prior to getting any feedback on the actual people from usage after the release.
Yeah, that's a good point. This does not add any new functionality. This just potentially makes the API a little bit less verbose.
Yeah, I think the way it's just, I don't have any problems with this change. I think it's fine. I'm just wondering about, I think when we get, when people start using it, we'll probably get feedback about, oh, there's a lot of copy paste or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think both of those points, James, you raised are very good point. Like, we still haven't talked about conflict resolution, like in routes or route conflicts, but how this change complicates it, and it very well could. So, yeah, I'm fine either way. We merge this or we don't merge this, but if we can add in those comments into the PR, this is just something that we can reflect back on, like what we decided and why we decided against or for it, right?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that this doesn't really complicate anything in terms of conflicts. At least I can't think of any new conflict types that this would introduce.
So one little bit of potential conflict. I don't want to say this. This makes anything more complicated, but it just, we would need to document it very clearly, because the very literal interpretation of these being or matches and processed in order is actually different than how we process route rule. Route rule, we care about most specific match, which we really could translate to multiple matches here. But right now, as it's defined, if you had path foo and path foo bar, if you had a request to foo bar, it would hit this first one and go, because if that match is satisfied,
that is not how I intended it to be. So like
actually,
specific one takes precedence, right? The matching semantic is same. So
yeah, and now that I think about it, that doesn't even matter because the same action is being applied. Like everything else is consistent. So most specific match doesn't even matter here. It just means any of these all do the same thing. So yeah,
wait, that kind of that sort of longest match semantic, that would be applied across rules then.
Yeah. But within a rule, if there was a longest match, it doesn't matter because they're all going to the same thing. Yeah, I was confused.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, this makes sense to me. I will try and add a follow-up comment around this as well. And if anyone else wants to add anything here. I don't have a very strong feeling one way or the other as to whether or not we should try to include this in V1 Alpha 1. I get the point to avoid premature optimization, but if we do, imagine this being a pain point. yeah, I don't care too much on this one. Okay.
Rob, where's the language that talks about the longest matching behavior?
I don't know if it's anywhere other than a theoretical conflict resolution doc right now. I don't know that we have anything specifying that inside Go types yet. Bo should.
Okay.
Yeah, when I was working on this, I came across that thing, and I was like thinking of borrowing something that we added for Ingress V1 cap, Rob.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
something similar should probably be applied here, but we don't have that.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that seems like something like that is not going to change. You know, there's some parts of conflict resolution that are still very much at a proposal level and very rough, but I think the most specific match is very non-controversial and something.
Yeah, I guess the implication that I would take from reading the current Go doc is that I should apply the HTTP route rules in order. That's kind of how I would read if I was at, I'm just reading it in front of me, and I was like, it looks like, oh, there's a slice of rules. Without anything other guidance, I probably just go, they should be applied in order and done.
Yeah, that is a good point. I seem to remember with Ingress, we ended up going towards most specific match wins in this case. And I think especially with the idea that multiple routes can match a gateway, can be used by a gateway, I think order is going to be at least somewhat hard to make meaningful. You know, if you merge, routes, you know, which.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting.
Oh, I was trying to wait. Sorry. Basically what I was saying is if you merge routes, multiple route objects, you don't really know which should come first. We have a very abstract idea of ordering, at least with the selector. Obviously, if we had actual route references or routes embedded within a gateway, then you could make sense of ordering. But as it exists right now, I don't think that ordering can be meaningful because I think what we're describing here is merging routes, merging route objects. And so although you would have a consistent order within each route, that's all you have. And that's hard to be meaningful on its own. Sorry, Bo, you go ahead.
I don't know what it is with Zoom today. Yeah, that's an interesting point, is that we probably should try not to impose strict ordering, just because I don't think implementations will all support it. We have to double check though. One interesting thing is that the best match rule is also interesting because one of the ways to implement that with a strict ordering system is to sort it by best match and then put it in strict ordering. And then systems that can optimize on top of that and do so themselves. We'd probably want to do a little bit of a survey to see whether that's feasible, whether we can really say anything here, and how confusing that will be for people. Does anyone have any thoughts? Because I know that I don't know if every system that I know of can actually enforce that it has to do 1, then 2, then 3, and so forth.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think it would be good to understand that as well. It did seem like as we were going through the the ingress spec and updates that the idea of most specific match is fairly universally implementable, even if it is, like you're saying, ordering most specific match first in the actual implementation. Yeah, that's a good point. Any additional discussion on this one? Okay. The last ones are both from Jeremy. It doesn't look like he's here today, but I'll just mention these briefly. This is UDP route. It is, I looked briefly, it appears to be, basically an exact copy of TCP route with different names, but generally everything else behaves as you would expect. Yeah, I think based on our last discussion around UDP route, there was support for adding it because it was so similar to TCP route. I don't have many objections, though I do need to take a closer look at the actual spec here, but I'm fine with this idea. So I don't need to spend too much time on this because I don't think Jeremy's here, but I'll just, so you know, that's a PR that is ready for review. And similarly, based on feedback from last week, he went ahead and added an SNI match for TCP route. So this was really trivial change. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question for this is that do we want TCP route to have SNI as a concept, or just have an SNI route?
Yeah.
Because you could have like ETL, that's like a TCP route with SNI. It gets a little bit.
Yeah, at some point, I think you end up with too many route types, I should say. Unless there are really significant differences between what a TCP route and SNI route would be, I think I would personally bias towards a single route that's capable of both.
So another idea is to have the current TCP route and UDP route, just merge them into like some plain traffic splitting route, and then have SNI route be its own thing, instead of having TCP and UDP route basically be the same thing. Although we did talk about how TCP route could have a connection-oriented load balancing features, and UDP route would have a per packet load balancing features. So the things are not empty actually in the future if we could conceive of like where they could be going.
Yeah, I agree with that last comment. I feel like there's more room for TCP route and UDP route to eventually become significantly different, or at least support significantly different functionality in the future. Whereas this, at least right now, to me feels like something that can just be tacked on top of TCP route. But maybe that's naive. I don't know.
But it's not TCP. It's like a little bit like we have to think carefully about the naming, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I guess the other thing about that springs to mind about the TCP route having an SNI field is, can we make it follow the HTTP conventions a bit more? Would that make sense? So HTTP route, sorry, I misspoke. I mean HTTP route. P route has the spec, the host, the thing, the spec, the host, the action, right? So does it make sense to apply a similar structure to TCP route?
would that just be to better support SNI, or is this, would that be
Yeah, so
also?
this is, so here you've got the host name you've got the host name down in the match, but with HTTP route, you've got the host name at the top of the configuration object hierarchy. So they're kind of swapped around with regards to each other.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean.
So the structure of HTTP routes is you start with a host, then you start with an optional host, then you get down into matches and rules. Then you go to rule and then match. So would it make sense for, I don't know if Jeremy's on this call, but does it make sense for TCP route to do the same thing? You start with the host and then you go to the rules and the matches. Because if you want to go, if you make it look more like HTTP route, then the SNI would go kind of at the top as a optional host names, similar to HTTP route host. I can just give that feedback. I can like try some YAML and then get that feedback on the PR though.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I'm also interested in Bowie's suggestion here of if SNI even belongs on TCP route, but maybe it is helpful to pull it. At the very least, it could be helpful to pull it out of match and up to a top level. Now, to clarify, you're talking about top level being route, so SNI moving from match to route rule. Is that accurate, or is it even higher level on the TCP route spec itself?
Well, I guess if we follow the pattern of HTTP route, then we would insert a TCP route host, which would contain the slice of host names and the slice of rule, and the slice of and the rule or the slice of rules, I suppose.
Yeah.
Does anybody know whether Quick has the concept of a server name? Or does it inherit that from TLS 1.3?
I do not know. It's a good question. All right, well, yeah, I don't know if anyone else does. Definitely chime in. If not, is there any other thing to discuss on this one? Okay, great. The last thing that I wanted to cover today was some follow-up around conflict resolution. I've gotten some more feedback and I've spent some more time working on conflict resolution and trying to spec that out. This is a remarkably broad topic, and I'm trying to find the right scope without making this all-consuming. But I added a few questions at the top here. The first one of note is, are there any conflicts, or will there ever be conflicts that cross permission boundaries? I can't think of any right now, but the idea of a route being referenced that maybe not everyone has access to, I'm not entirely sure what that looks like yet, but it's something that I wanted to throw out there in case anyone thought of any potential conflict in this API that could also involve permissions. Yeah, and I will say there is something related to our route namespaces thing that is related to permissions, but I've got that later on. So maybe I'll at least mention this here, but I'm already covering this one. And then a broader discussion that actually I think James might have started earlier on, the lifetime coupling between gateways and their gateway class. And this issue and this discussion around this is not completely what I want to talk about, but it provides decent context. And as I recall, the suggestion was which I think makes sense, to recommend at least adding a finalizer to gateway class resources that would prevent a gateway class from being deleted if gateways still existed for that gateway class. I think that's helpful to what I wanted to discuss, but it may not solve everything. So there are a few problems with this, or a few potential problems with decoupling between gateway class and gateway. One of them is obviously what happens when the gateway class disappears. Given that number one guiding principle of prefer not to break things that are already working, you would think that deleting a gateway class should either be prevented if there are active gateways, or if it is not prevented, should not result in all the gateways that implemented that gateway class immediately going away, because that feels like a very destructive action. So the finalizer approach is one way to handle that. Another way to handle that is to somehow tie some level of gateway class information to the gateway itself, so the gateway can be self-sufficient after creation. So this is a bit of a change in thinking that may not make sense, but that background is also that idea is at least somewhat motivated by other potential conflicts that we could run into. I know of at least some implementations where potential changes to gateway class, or maybe the parameters that gateway class is associated with, could potentially end up being incompatible. So you could potentially make a change in a gateway class parameter, or even gateway class with the allowed route namespaces that would potentially break or significantly disrupt your gateway, which again feels like something like that is dangerous, especially if it could apply to a large number of gateways at once. Disruptive changes to a single resource seem to be at least somewhat acceptable, but disruptive changes to a single resource that then affect multiple gateways are something that I would love to avoid, if at all possible.
Are we already in this situation with ingress? Because with ingress class, you can attach a configuration resource, and if that configuration resource changes, then that change could flow down to every ingress that you control.
Yeah, it is a very real potential issue there as well. There is a lot less guidance in that API as far as what should or should not be done, and very minimal guidance around conflict resolution. And I'd say the potential, and obviously this is going to be different per implementation, but it feels like potential conflict or potential disruption could be even greater at this level, because this API could potentially be controlling even more resources, potentially. And it depends on your ingress implementation and your gateway implementation and what those map to and whatever. But either way, yeah, you're right. There's already...
Yeah, to give some context, we went to the storage folks, because they have storage class, to ask their advice on this. And this thing is exactly what they told us that they wish they did.
Yeah, the idea of finding some kind of way, and this admittedly gets really messy. I don't know that there is great prior art here other than that, wish they took this approach kind of thing. But the idea is, okay, if you can say a gateway class is almost more template-like than anything, that, the gateway created from a gateway class contains a set of properties from the gateway class at that point. In a sense, that's helpful, but it comes with other potential negatives, including how do you store that extra information, and then how do you understand it? It also makes a gateway class potentially less meaningful. If you have a gateway class with a consistent name, but the attributes associated with that gateway class have changed over time, there's potential that you have multiple gateways using the same class, but effectively different versions of that same class, which feels messy.
I'm not sure that might not be implementable either. Because if the gateway class, the parameterized gateway class represents, as parameters in some underlying infrastructure, then that's going to change when it changes. So you can't necessarily cookie cut that infrastructure and into snapshots to keep it the same for gateway classes that have already been created.
Yeah, so maybe I'm not sure I completely understand that. So we couldn't. I think what you're saying is we can't snapshot different gateway classes at a specific point in time.
Sorry, I might have got the wrong end of the handle on
Okay.
your. What I thought you were saying was that when it was that the attributes of the gateway class are pinned to, are basically snapshotted and become part of the gateway when a gateway is created. So that if the gateway class changes, any gateway, that would only affect new gateways, not existing gateways.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is what I had brought up. I hate to even say suggested, because I'm not even sure that I necessarily think this is the best approach. I'm just interested in exploring it further. As an example of this approach, that proposed change to where gateways could be created with a gateway class. Again, only applying to creation instead of update. Like this general move to moving things to where you can control them and provide immediate feedback, and to where a change to that field is not going to be destructive. But I don't know the right balance there, because I know if we go too far that side, then gateway class starts to lose its meaning, especially if it changes significantly. You have multiple gateway classes of, say, I don't know, external load balancer class. And what do you know, at some point somebody decided it shouldn't actually represent an external load balancer, and they flipped that switch. And so some of those with that class mean one thing, and some of those mean something else. I think that's a really extreme example. But if we went too far with this kind of snapshotting and point in time gateway class meaning, we could end up there.
Here's an example from Contour World, which might be more germane. We have config, which lets you specify default timeout parameters for HTTP sessions. So you would create, you would specify that presumably on the gateway class, and then any gateways which are created would get those timeouts. If you update the gateway class with new timeouts, should existing gateways be updated too, or just new gateways?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, in a sense, I feel like they're, you know, something like a timeout feels relatively mundane, and it seems like the kind of thing that, at least in some cases, could be, again, this is so implementation specific, but I'm assuming a number of implementations will be able to make that change without any kind of dramatic, breaking, disruptive effects.
Yeah,
Whereas
I think
there
that's definitely implementable, but you could
Yeah.
also break, you could also quite easily break everybody's virtual hosts all at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the example with timeouts makes me think this is the sort of thing that you should be able to specify in the gateway class and then override on a parameter by parameter basis in the gateway. So the class gives you defaults and the gateway can override those defaults. Now, as far as handling what happens if you delete a gateway class or updated the gateway class, that makes me think maybe if you delete the gateway class, you should propagate all those values that were defaulted to the gateway so that it preserves those values. Maybe that's a terrible idea, but in a way, at least then you can look at your gateway and it has a consistent state and you have well-defined behavior for if you delete the gateway class.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm proposing.
Yeah, one interesting point though is that if you have to do that, you might as well get the snapshotting behavior anyways, because you're going to be doing it kind of to support that. The difficult one is not the delete. The difficult one is the editing the gateway class. I'm fairly certain there are going to be parameters that are extremely awkward to edit. And because Kubernetes doesn't have like a way to kind of corral the kind of edits you can do, at least easily, this presents a problem for the surface area.
And you know, maybe to take this one step further, this is potentially further complicated by the idea that most of the parameters we're talking about are likely not going to be on gateway class itself, but instead on the parameters resource that a gateway class references. And as such, those parameters could be any number of things that may not actually have a way to consistently, like we can't predict what a parameter is going to be because they're intentionally implementation specific. So it's relatively difficult to attach them directly to a gateway because, you know, timeout is generic. So sure, maybe timeout would be a top level gateway class parameter. I'm not actually sure. And that could have a place in gateway configuration as well. It gets a lot messier, at least in my opinion, for some very implementation specific parameters that we would also potentially like to lock in place at creation, or at least set at creation, and then have those stay tied to the gateway and not the gateway class. So this is a bigger topic, and as I'm thinking about it more, and I'm realizing that this on its own, although it's related to conflict resolution, is likely worthy of its own issue, just on its own, because there's a lot of potential for change here. Yeah, the whole gateway class is great, except life cycle conflict resolution is pretty difficult to manage well without the potential for disruptive or breaking changes. Or yeah, like Bowie said, or meant in chat, you can always make everything immutable, and that would work. It just means that you would end up with a lot of gateway classes, but that would work if a gateway class is forever and always the same thing, and then you just end up with lots of gateway classes with new versions. Yeah.
My attention wandered for a second, and when Bo made a comment saying this is what the storage class folks told us to do given their experience, could you remind me what he was referring to?
Okay, yeah, sure. So storage class has parameters. Storage class is, probably the best example of something like long live that is at least somewhat familiar to gateway class. And storage class, SIG storage, I can't remember who we specifically talked to from that SIG, but I think it was Saad. Anyways, he recommended, he mentioned that if they could do it all over from scratch, it would be nice if you could freeze those parameters when a new persistent volume, whatever it happens to be, maybe whatever the equivalent in that space is created, that those parameters are stuck with that PV instead of the weird potential state changes. That was my interpretation of that conversation. But we feel free to correct me on that one. But again, it's related to this whole thing of these state changes are messy, and if we can somehow not deal with them, that would be great. Which I know.
Yeah, I think we can talk to them more to get an understanding, but I think right now, if you edit the storage class, the behavior is just kind of under-specified. That was my impression.
Okay, so they were saying that you might be better off with just saying that the parameter is going to be, the parameter resource will be immutable and basically pinned at the time of gateway class creation.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense for storage. So we can see what we do here. But right now, I don't know if they explicitly say it would behave one way or the other. And I don't even know if, like, you deleted it somehow, everything would still work. This is for storage classes.
And
upgrades are sort of an. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Oh, okay. I was going to. It just occurred to me that upgrades are also an interesting corner case for this. For in-cluster ingresses, when you upgrade the controller, that does that upgrading the controller changes things, right, to your gateway class, so it's no longer immutable. You might upgrade. You might have to upgrade your configuration at the same time, but you certainly don't want to remove all your gateways in order to have to do that.
That's right. That's a edit quote unquote to your class.
And one thing I should add here is that anything that we're suggesting here is not something that we can really enforce. Like a lot of this discussion, as I understand it, is about a CRD that we reference, which is great, but this CRD is going to be implementation specific, this parameter CRD. So we can't enforce a specific pattern here, but we can certainly recommend one.
Yeah, I think it's worth talking about just because implementers will hit this right away.
Yeah.
And we should have some advice as to like, hey, we should handle it like this, or maybe like one or two choices. Especially if like, what we don't want is to kind of just have a C language, like undefined behavior where it just kind of could blow up in very strange ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to go off, I think it was Micaiah's idea of, basically setting parameters on the gateway or associating them with the gateway initially, that could be accomplished by making some form of copy of that parameter CR that was tied to and owned by the gateway resource as it was created. So you would have that kind of immediate thing that you could then change those parameters on that CR that was tied specifically to that gateway only.
I'm not sure that's quite what I meant.
Okay.
I was saying the gateway class specifies parameters. The gateway can specify parameters overriding what's in the gateway class. Then if you delete the gateway class, you need to propagate those things that weren't explicitly set in the gateway. And I'm not saying that's a great idea, but it's an idea that would give you consistent behavior.
Right, that wouldn't solve the edit problem, I don't think.
Yeah, it's still tough if there's a change and that change is disruptive. That doesn't necessarily help. It does help with the gateway class removal, but I think a very similar idea to that would be the just copy those defaults and set them on creation, and gateway owners can then override them with whatever custom values they want from there on. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's more like a gateway prototype than a gateway class.
Yeah.
There are languages where prototypes are, well, that's different. In JavaScript.
Yeah, I was thinking in the JavaScript sense.
Yeah. All right, well, this has been very helpful. I think this conversation merits a follow-up issue, so I will try and file something around this for further discussion. As always, this is also a doc that I think everyone not only has comment access to, but edit access to. So if you think of anything else that you think you should add or we should cover, please go ahead and do that. I've added a few things since the last time we talked about conflict resolution, so there's plenty that could use feedback here. So that's it for today, I guess. I know we're already over time, but thanks to everyone for the great conversation and feedback.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
talk to you tomorrow.